This did not begin with a declaration of war. It began with a pattern, one that most people ignored because it did not look like a crisis yet. Small escalations, quiet deployments, signals buried beneath headlines that felt routine, but beneath that surface, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The modern battlefield is no longer defined by who has the most advanced weapons, but by who understands the limits of the system they are fighting against. And last night, in a scenario that analysts have long feared but rarely explained clearly, those limits were pushed all at once. Hundreds of incoming threats arriving not in sequence, but in synchronized waves, from multiple directions, compressing time and overwhelming decision-making at every level. This was not chaos. It was precision. It was not about power in the traditional sense. It was about timing, volume, and inevitability. For decades, the assumption has been that layered defense systems can absorb any attack if they are advanced enough. That assumption is now under pressure. Because when a system is forced to process more than it was designed to handle, it does not adapt. It breaks, and when it breaks, the consequences are not contained to military targets. They ripple outward into civilian life. Political stability and global perception. The question is no longer whether such a scenario is possible. The question is what happens when it is. What most observers still misunderstand is that modern war is not ultimately decided by who is stronger, but by who reaches the breaking point first. Every defense system, no matter how advanced, is built on assumptions: how many threats it will face, how fast it can respond, how efficiently it can allocate resources under pressure. Systems like Iron Dome and Arrow 3 are not designed to be invincible. They are designed to operate within a calculable range of stress. When that range is exceeded, the system does not fight harder. It simply performs exactly as engineered, prioritizing some threats, ignoring others, and inevitably allowing leakage. This is where the uncomfortable truth emerges. Failure in this context is not a collapse of courage or competence. It is a mathematical outcome. When incoming volume exceeds processing capacity, the result is predetermined. And that realization reframes everything, because it means that even the most sophisticated military architecture in the world can be defeated not by superior technology, but by a strategy that understands its limits better than its designers anticipated. What turns this from theory into something far more dangerous is the architecture of the attack itself. A single-axis strike can be intercepted, studied, and contained, but a synchronized, multi-directional assault compresses time and multiplies complexity in ways that no system can fully absorb. Imagine hundreds of ballistic trajectories arriving from one vector while thousands of shorter-range projectiles flood in from another, all within overlapping time windows. This is not just a higher volume of threats. It is a fundamentally different problem. Decision makers are forced to assign priorities in seconds, often without full information, while systems designed for sequential engagement are pushed into simultaneous overload. This level of coordination does not happen by accident. It requires years of preparation, disciplined command structures, and a strategic understanding that the objective is not to destroy every target, but to create a moment where the defense system itself becomes the bottleneck. In that moment, superiority shifts, not because one side is inherently stronger, but because one side has engineered a scenario the other cannot process in time. And this is where the concept of leakage transforms from a manageable risk into a cascading failure. Under normal conditions, a defense system accepts that a small percentage of threats will get through. That is built into the design. But when saturation occurs, leakage is no longer marginal. It becomes systemic. Interceptors are consumed faster than they can be replenished. Radar systems track more objects than they were designed to resolve. Critical decisions are made with incomplete data, increasing the probability of misallocation. And once that threshold is crossed, every additional second compounds the problem. What slips through is no longer incidental, it is inevitable. At that point, the battlefield expands beyond military infrastructure and into civilian life, where the psychological impact becomes as significant as the physical damage. This is the moment where a conflict stops being contained and starts becoming transformational, not because of a single breakthrough, but because the system, under extreme pressure, has reached the limits of what it can sustain. At that point, the decision facing military leadership is no longer framed in terms of victory or defeat, but in terms of preservation versus collapse. Continuing to fight is no longer a question of resolve. It becomes a question of whether the remaining capacity of the system can sustain another cycle of saturation. When interceptor inventories are depleted faster than they can be replaced, when air assets are stretched across multiple fronts, and when command structures are forced into reactive mode rather than proactive control, the logic shifts. A ceasefire, in this context, is not an admission of weakness. It is an acknowledgement of reality. It is the moment when leadership recognizes that extending the engagement would not change the outcome, only magnify the cost, and that cost is not abstract. It is measured in infrastructure that cannot be quickly rebuilt, in civilian populations pushed to their psychological limits, and in a military apparatus that risks losing its ability to function altogether. This is where the human dimension becomes unavoidable, because behind every calculation is a population that must live with the consequences of decisions made under extreme pressure, where every additional hour of conflict compounds damage that may take years to repair. But this is also the point where the narrative demands scrutiny, because a scenario this precise, this synchronized, and this overwhelming raises an essential question. Is this an inevitable reality or a constructed projection of what could happen under ideal conditions for one side? Strategic analysis is only valuable if it challenges itself. There are variables that such a scenario cannot fully account for: intelligence breakthroughs, preemptive disruptions, unforeseen operational failures, and the unpredictable nature of human decision-making under stress. As Professor Weiming Zhang has argued, the most dangerous mistake in strategic thinking is to confuse a logically consistent model with an inevitable outcome. Even the most carefully designed operation exists in a world of friction, where plans degrade the moment they encounter resistance. This does not invalidate the scenario, but it does remind us that reality rarely unfolds in perfect alignment with theory, and that any serious analysis must leave room for uncertainty. This uncertainty becomes even more critical when we expand the frame beyond the immediate battlefield and into the broader strategic environment. For the United States, the implications of such a scenario are not limited to military support for an ally. They extend into a complex web of escalation risks, economic consequences, and global signaling. Direct intervention carries the possibility of triggering a wider regional conflict, one that could disrupt energy flows, destabilize financial systems, and draw multiple actors into a confrontation with no clear endpoint. Yet restraint carries its own cost, signaling limits to American reach and raising questions among allies about the reliability of long-standing security guarantees. This is the dilemma that defines great power decision-making in the modern era, not the absence of options, but the presence of only costly ones. In such moments, power is not measured by the ability to act decisively, but by the capacity to navigate constraints without triggering consequences that spiral beyond control. What emerges from a scenario like this is not just a temporary imbalance, but a signal of a deeper structural shift. The assumption of a single dominant power shaping outcomes in the Middle East is increasingly under strain, replaced by a more complex environment where multiple actors possess the capability to influence events in decisive ways. This does not create stability, it creates unpredictability. Regional powers begin to reassess their strategies, alliances become more fluid, and deterrence is no longer anchored in reputation alone, but in demonstrated adaptability. A system that once relied on clear hierarchies of power now faces a landscape where outcomes are shaped by coordination, timing, and the ability to exploit systemic limits. This is what defines a multipolar reality, not balance, but constant negotiation under uncertainty, where every actor must recalibrate not just what they can do, but what they should do in order to avoid triggering consequences they cannot control. In the end, the real lesson of this entire scenario is not about who wins and who loses, but about how modern conflict is evolving beyond traditional definitions of strength. We have seen how systems can be pushed beyond their limits, how decisions once framed as absolute become conditional under pressure, and how even the most advanced structures are ultimately bound by the logic they were built upon. But we have also seen that behind every strategic calculation lies a human cost that cannot be ignored. This is not just a story about missiles, defenses, or geopolitical shifts. It is about the fragile line between control and escalation and how quickly it can disappear. If this analysis has helped you see the bigger picture, save this video so you can return to it as events continue to unfold. Subscribe to the channel to stay ahead of the deeper forces shaping global conflict, not just the headlines, because understanding is no longer optional in a world like this. It is essential. And while the future may be uncertain, the ability to think clearly, question assumptions, and seek deeper insight remains the one advantage that no crisis can take away.